Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Taboo with Mimi. I am here joined today with Bailey, and I can't wait to tell you this story because I feel it's going to be a very interesting one. But first and foremost, who are you?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here, Mimi. I'm so excited. And I know that we'll probably get into talking about maybe some personal things that have happened, but I usually just start off with my professional overview. So my name is Bailey Hauser. I am a licensed professional counselor. I've been a therapist for about 10 years, and I specialize in trauma and addiction. And specifically within addiction, I specialize in substance abuse, so drugs and alcohol, and sex addiction.
Huh. I see.
So, yeah, when I tell people, I usually don't tell people that, like, in a grocery store or something, because people don't usually know how to respond to that. But, I'm married. I have an almost 3-year-old working overseas right now as a therapist. And I'm working on my side gig, which is a podcast. And most people assume that it's like a heal your inner child podcast. It's not, it's a true crime podcast. So that's what my sister and I do on our side.
That's so cool. Can we rewind for a second? Because you said you're a therapist, and I know this because we've talked about it, but how did you become a addiction and sex therapist, basically?
So I'll give you kind of like the short, condensed version.
Yes.
I got a degree. My undergraduate was in psychology and biology. And out of college, I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I ended up getting a job working as a case manager in like a state funded addiction facility that worked with the indigent population. And that was my first exposure to, that setting. I fell in love with it. Like, I love it so much. And it sounds maybe a little crass or a little crazy, but like, I love addicts. I love working with them. They're my favorite humans in the world. And, I got through my career. I did that for several years. And then I got an opportunity when we had a facility closure. My parent company had a facility in Arizona, and they said the only positions we have available is an eating disorder therapist option or a therapist, a sex addiction therapist option that works in the all male inpatient facility. And I was like, that's what I want to do. And so it really, I think, kind of in a fortuitous way, my journey and my career path really was chosen for me. And I love it.
Amazing. And when you start working as a sex addiction or abuse therapist, did you find out anything about yourself or did you discover anything new?
Yeah. So this is probably a good segue, right? Into it's interesting because, I started getting the specialized training in this, and it was a steep learning curve. It's a whole different kind of branch of addiction, different behaviors, different everything. And realized that my ex husband was a sex addict. And I didn't know how to put my finger on that. I didn't have the language for it. I didn't have the awareness of that until I got into that role as a therapist. And I was like, oh, wow, this is what that was. And I didn't know that's what that was.
The haha moment.
Yeah. I was just like, oh, well, this is definitely a higher power thing, whatever you want to say. And so it was rewarding, but it was also, I started working with a trauma therapist personally. And because a lot of old traumas came up from the work that I was doing and the betrayal that I had experienced in past relationships. And so honestly, it kind of kicked me into higher gear to take care of some things that I think maybe just laid dormant for a long time, but they were starting to kind of bubble up. And I was like, all right, well, looks like we're going to kill two birds with one stone.
Yeah. And I think those are the best kind of therapists because they actually been through it and they
Oh, yeah.
know that thing and they can help other people. But just to help us understand, just to give us a little bit of context, how would you define or what is a sex addict, basically?
Yeah. So a sex addict, when we use the word sex addiction, it's kind of just a catch all phrase. for
Right.
compulsive sexuality. And so it's really what it boils down to is somebody who has a hard time kind of staying within the social confines of any sexual behaviors. And usually there's compulsion involved. So they do it even though they don't want to. And there's some impulsions involved, which is they just kind of do it on a drop of a hat, even didn't really think it through. And so a lot of the behaviors at the core of what sex addiction is it's an intimacy disorder. And the way that I kind of, I guess, define intimacy is into me, you see, right? And so if you're disordered in that area, you have a really hard time bonding with people on another level. And so, really, at the end of the day, a sex addict is trying their best to bond and attach with another person, but they don't have the skills and they don't really know how to do that. And so they turn to sex or sexual behaviors as a way to fill their cup because they're missing something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What does it look like though? Because I mean, in theory, absolutely it makes sense, but what can it look like in a relationship? Because in my head, have had some experience. I've had too much, sometimes too don't much. And especially I remember when we were prepping for this, I remember it got me thinking, I'm like, oh my God, have I ever experienced anything like that? Because there isn't, I mean, first of all, sex is taboo in any shape or form, but I we don't really know anything about this. So
Yeah. Yeah. So I think kind of what I'm hearing is what's the line? Where's the line in the sand between like, this is kind of just normal stuff. And then this is where it starts getting to where like the field of addiction, right?
right.
And, and I want to be super clear like, one of the big misconceptions with me being a sex addiction therapist and general people will think, oh, sex is bad or it's harmful. And that's not at all the case. And that's never the narrative when I'm working with people. Like long-term celibacy or abstinence is not the goal. We want you to have fun and healthy and happy sex with kind of whoever you want. We just want to make sure that you're not hurting yourself in some type of way and you're not hurting somebody else in some type of way. That's really at the core of what we're trying to weed out. And so, like, there aren't necessarily specific sexual behaviors because context is absolutely key when I'm working with somebody with potentially a sexual addiction. Like somebody who watches porn, I'm not going to be like, oh, that might be a problem. But somebody who watches it 8 hours a day and they masturbate so much that they end up bleeding from their genitals, that's kind of a problem, right? Like that's more problematic. And so the disorder isn't defined by like the number of sexual partners you have had or any specific sexual behaviors. It's really about it's marked by an individual's sexual behavior when it becomes the central focus of their life to the point of them neglecting their health, their relationships, their interests, their hobbies, their responsibilities, right? And so I mean, you could kind of use the same context for an alcoholic. Somebody who might drink heavily arguably isn't an alcoholic per se, right? But if they're forgetting to pick their kids up from school, right? They're calling out sick 3 times a week. They're getting scans done by their doctors that they have elevated pancreas, like levels with their pancreas. Like all of those things will be hallmark indicators that this might be a problem. And so with that being said, right? And I just want to be really clear because I don't want people to think that, especially my kind of genre of therapist or my niche of therapist, I just wanted to make sure that your listeners hear that my job as a therapist isn't to judge you and isn't to tell you what is right or wrong sexually for you, but I can help give some assessments and indications and kind of go through that process if it does become a problem. And so some of the common behaviors, like some of the common areas is the first thing that I'm going to look at is if there is dishonesty and secrecy around sexual behaviors. If somebody comes to me and they say, I watch pornography, and I'm just going to be like, okay, that's whatever, that's fine. And if I say, "Is that a problem for you? Like, do you feel that's a problem?" And if they're like, maybe, I don't know." And I say, "Well, how many hours a day do you watch?" And they're like, "1." Right? I'm gonna be like, why are you bringing this up? Because watching it an hour a day arguably is not that big of a deal, right? In the big kind of lens of life.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. And but then if a week later they acknowledge that they watch it 5 hours a day, then that's probably an indication that it's problematic, right? And so lying and secrecy is a big component because if you're not doing anything wrong, whether socially wrong or morally wrong for yourself, then you're not going to lie about it. Right. And, the other thing is there's usually a preoccupation with sex in general. Okay. Some people think about sex more often than others. And I'm not saying that you're a sex addict because you think about it a lot. But when I say a preoccupation, I mean, like if anybody's ever gone on a diet, right? Or they'd fasted for whatever reason and they start thinking about like, oh man, I would love to have a chocolate cookie right now. And that is all they think about and they cannot think about anything else. That's usually an indication. When they've tried to set boundaries around their own behavior. So if they say, like, I'm not going to cheat on my girlfriend, and then they cheat on their girlfriend, then that's an indication because if you don't have a problem with it, then you don't have a problem sticking within your own boundaries around it, right? And another kind of big piece is the emotional experience like before, during, and after. And that's kind of a complicated thing to dive into. But if somebody walks away from some sort of sexual behavior or interaction and they feel really guilty or shameful, right? Then that's an indication that you're probably violating some sort of boundaries, right?
Yeah. This is so very interesting. And from the perspective of the partner, because you said you had that moment, it's like, oh, I've realized there was like something wrong with my ex-husband. What does it look like for the partner? Because right now that you were talking about it, and I'm sure like a lot of the listeners would probably do the same. They would probably either go through their behaviors or their partners or ex-partners' behaviors, like, oh, did that happen to me? Because if someone like I'm thinking like if one of my ex-partners like watched 5 hours of porn a day, I probably didn't know that, or I probably didn't notice that because it's like I wasn't with him maybe like for 5 hours a day. So I wonder like when was like the moment when you realize if you want to talk about it, oh, there was something wrong with that, and also as a person on like on the other side, what does it look like?
So I'll do my best to answer that. From my
Yeah,
personal experience with my ex, of course, hindsight is 2020. Hindsight's a luxury, hindsight's a privilege. So you can look back on things and say, wow, that's so clear to me now, or I didn't see that when I was in it. And that's really normal, right? And so I hope, whoever's listening, don't beat yourself up about it. Excuse me. But I remember when we first started dating, we were having those kind of like typical dating conversations about like intimacy and sex and family and relationships and jobs and careers, just normal kind of stuff. And I remember he said something along the lines of, I'm not a very emotional person. I've always been kind of robotic. And so, me as a sex addiction therapist now, that is usually a hallmark indicator, right? And I don't mean if they have other diagnoses, like if they're on the spectrum, like, you know, this isn't a one size fits all. It needs to be individualized. So
of
I want to be
course.
clear.
Yeah,
But and I remember in my mind, in my young mind, I said, well, that's okay. Like, I'll fix you of that. Like you just don't know me well enough yet. Like I'll love you through it. Okay.
mhm.
And I'm sure there are lots of people listening who are like,
This
I've
is
been
so
there.
relatable.
Yeah.
Incredibly.
And I was just, and I didn't think that I was, being silly or I was being unhealthy, right? At the time.
Right.
And so he told me very clearly from the beginning, he gave me a breadcrumb trail and I just convinced myself that the red flags were pink and pink was my favorite color, right? Like I just totally looked past all of these things. And so that was the very first one that I can recall being kind of like a red flag, if you will. In the moment where I knew that there was something significantly wrong kind of going on, I mean, it's a whole mess and there's a lot, but the first one was we were on a road trip to my old hometown and we had to stop at the gas station. I had to use the restroom. There was nothing around. So I was like, I'm going to go into the gas station. I'm going to, get a water or a Coke or whatever. I don't know. Do you want anything? No, it's fine. I'll stay in the car. And so when I got out of the car, I was walking around the back of the car and I just kind of looked through the back windshield and I saw him on his phone and he was swiping. And I knew, and it was just like a split second view that I could see from the back of the car, like into the car where he was sitting on his phone. And he was swiping like Tinder, right? I knew he was swiping. And I got around to the side of the car and I looked at his phone and I opened the door and I was like, "Were you on Tinder? Like, were you just swiping on something?" And I think we were engaged at this point, right? Or we were married. I don't remember. And he was just like, "No. I was playing this like phone game." And I was like, "No, like I saw you swiping." And so this is another indicator. So as you guys are listening, this is what we call gaslighting, right? And he was just like, "No, that's not what I was doing. I was playing a game on my phone." And I was like, "Show me." And he pulled up his phone and the game that he was playing, when it would cut to a next level or whatever, like white clouds would come in and then they would go away. And he'd be like, "That's probably what you saw, is it looked like I was swiping, but it was the clouds in this game." Right.
Mhm.
And it sounds ridiculous now. Okay. But when you're in it, you really are just like, that's plausible.
You're engaged or married basically at this point. So like,
Yeah.
I
Like, why
could
would
be
you
wrong.
lie about
Yeah.
something like that? Right. And so even though, like, in my brain, I kind of wrote it off, in my gut, I knew that there was something wrong there. I knew it, but I couldn't put my finger on it because I didn't have any evidence. And so one of the things that I hear a lot, because I also work with the term that you'll hear me say is betrayed partners. And these are men and women who are in an agreed upon monogamous relationship and they violate those boundaries sexually, physically, whatever. That's what causes betrayal. And we call it betrayal trauma. And so, one of the big indicators, right, when I work with women is I hear the same thing 100% of the time, even if they didn't have data, even if they didn't have evidence. I hear them say, "I knew that there was something off, but I couldn't put my finger on it." Right? I knew that there was something that wasn't sitting well with me, but I couldn't they didn't have the words for it. They didn't have the understanding around it until, of course, like other things happened and shed some light and so on and so forth. And so that's a big one, and I excused that behavior for a long time when I would want to be intimate, and I don't necessarily even mean sexually. He just wasn't super available. He was there and he's a really nice person. We're cordial now. We had a pretty agreeable split, but he just wasn't there fully. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. The gut feeling, right? This gut feeling and the like this instincts that a lot of people have and then you can really understand what it is. And then after you understand. So it all started from there. But if I feel like if I wanted to understand how do we begin this process, when does it come the moment to say, for example, oh, I should probably look for some help?
I think it's really just depending on the person.
Yeah.
The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And that is addiction, right? Like we try the same things and we always relapse. We always go back to it. It doesn't stick, right? And and so I'll have people come to me in a preventative way, like, I've noticed that maybe my relationships aren't super healthy and I just kind of want to get ahead of it. But that's super rare. Most of the time, most of the time people come to me when there's a crisis.
Mhm.
And most of the time that's usually infidelity has been identified in the relationship and everybody's freaking out, right? And either the betrayed partner will come for support because they're overwhelmed with roller coaster emotions and shock and betrayal, and just it's a really messy process for them. And then the partners, the addicts, will come because they were found out and they don't want to lose custody of their children. They don't want to lose their house. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to lose their partners. And I know it sounds kind of crazy, but most of them really do love their partners. They don't know how to tap into that without some kind of clinical guidance around it. Right. So I think that the short answer is it just really depends on the person. But the thing that I challenge people to question is, like, the one word I always look for when it comes to, like, assessing addiction is the word distress. So, is it causing distress in your life? Is it causing you to mess up at work? Is it causing you to not spend time with your kids? Is it causing distress? Then that's usually an indicator that it wouldn't hurt to have somebody to help guide you through it.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed any gender differences? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, yes, the behaviors will look a little bit different, kind of if we were to keep this um, really kind of rigid and old school with like male and female, right? The behaviors are going to look different in male populations. It's going to look different in age groups of male populations. Behaviors look different in female populations, age groups, and then also like the LGBTQ community, you have kind of different behaviors there. So it
Right.
really does. Like there are differences in different kind of subpopulations, and that's why I mean it's such a strenuous training process for this certificate, this training, this license that I have. It was a 2-year process for me to become
Wow.
credentialed in this. And, when I was working in private practice as a sex addiction therapist in the state I was working in, I think there were 3 of us for the whole state.
Wow.
And I'll provide you with resources you can add and like show notes and stuff so people can,
Look it up.
find,
Yeah.
yeah, look it up and resources and all that. But that's why it's crucial that people identify a specialist, right? Like you wouldn't go to a heart doctor if you're having GI issues. And so it's kind of the same thing with therapy. I've had to kind of clean up some messes from therapists who were not trained and did not understand betrayal trauma or sex addiction and made it more problematic and more of a mess. And so because they just didn't know what they were working with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if across all genders, is there any prevalent type of distress, like a lot where people come to you for this one thing as opposed to other type of things, for example?
I mean, most of the populations I've worked with, because I started off working with males, right, in an
Hmm.
inpatient male facility. And most of the behaviors was infidelity, cheating on their partners, right? Now, other behaviors wrapped into that could be compulsive masturbation. They masturbated a whole lot all the time. They watched a whole lot of porn, or they watched really boundary violating kind of pornography that wasn't super good for them to be watching, or it was illegal and it was really bad and taboo. And so you can have some of those tied in, but most of the time it's cheating on a partner.
Yeah, that is like the most prevalent one.
Mhm.
So interesting because I was like reading or listening to some other podcasts a few days ago or a few weeks ago, and it was like saying how like it is totally normal for men because they're biologically predisposed to cheat. And I was like, so I feel like this is a very interesting conversation because I feel like, and it isn't so taboo because for so many years, this kind of type of behaviors is being like not just normalized, but it also excused. Like, oh, they're like, no, they're men. Of course they cheat or
Yeah.
stuff like that.
As an addiction therapist, and listen, I'm sure that there are going to be some people listening to me and they're like, I would never want her as my therapist. And that's okay. That's fair. I'm a pretty intense person. Most of my expertise, all of my expertise is around addiction, really. And as an addiction therapist, you cannot let shit slide. You cannot let people take a victim corner. You cannot let excuses happen because that's the nature of the disease. And so I have like a 0 BS tolerance when it comes to stuff like that. And so, if I have, let's say, a guy come to me and he's like, yeah, like I cheated on my wife, but, we're mammals and guys are more predisposed, the same thing, right? I kind of hear the same thing. And I just shut that down. I'm just like, listen, regardless of if that's the case, that doesn't excuse the fact that you knowingly, as a rational adult, made a promise to another person that you weren't going to do it. So it doesn't matter that I have red hair. I'm predisposed to be an angry bitch, but I don't get to walk around and cussing people out and calling them names. I don't get to do that just because I'm predisposed to being temperamental. Right. And I'll tell them, I'm like, that's fucking bullshit. And you know it. And we're not doing that shit here. Right. And they're usually like, yeah, you're right. And my thing is like, if you feel that you're not a monogamous person, then don't get into a monogamous relationship. If you feel like you need to have 4 partners, then go have 4 partners. But the key that I talk to them about is all of your 4 partners need to give consent that they know what they're getting into, and the boundaries of the relationship is very clear. So even if you're in a polyamorous relationship, where I work with people who are polyamorous. And so that's the big difference is you can't go back and use that excuse because you stood in front of somebody, you said marriage vows, right? You made these promises to this person that you were going to be in a monogamous relationship. So you can't excuse that now, right?
Yeah. I have two quick questions. The first one is, when you basically became a sex therapist or addiction therapist, there were only three of you in the whole state. Do you think that's going to change because we're also opening up and we're talking more about sex and all of these things? Do you think that's going to change, or do you think this is still going to be kind of a niche because sex is always going to
Yeah.
be? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. It's definitely a newer, what kind of category, if you will. You know, it wasn't kind of like a formalized thing for a long time. And there's still professionals and people out there who don't believe it's a real thing, right?
Right.
They say it's just an excuse for people to act poorly. And I would just say to them, if I could, I would invite you into sessions with these people who are at their core, they're an addict and they can't just stop on their own or they would have, right? But other than that, I think it depends on the area. Where I was working was kind of in the Bible Belt. So that adds a layer of people are not going to seek out that kind of support because, right, it's just even more taboo in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to add a little, maybe controversial question, but do you think because America is such a Christian country, do you think there is an extra layer that is added to all of this because of the religion or the older religions? Because I'm European, I'm Italian, and Italy is an extremely religious country. Yet I feel like the US is just like next level in terms of like how people actually love to express their faith, which I think is beautiful. But I think when it comes to this type of things, it could hinder some of your work. Do you think that is the case?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. hmm There's, I don't know if I could even name off the top of my head the people that I've worked with. A lot of times there is religious shame early on. And one of the things that I say is neurons that fire together wire together. And so what happens is like the sexual addiction, you don't wake up one day and you're like, I'm going to cheat on my wife and have sex with 3 sex workers in the span of 4 hours a day. Like that doesn't happen that way. It starts off usually in childhood. It starts off usually in like adolescent years. And a lot of the times, and I don't want to paint a, it's never all or nothing or black or white, but a lot of the times what happens is somebody who maybe grew up in a really religious household, and I'm not knocking religion, I'm not knocking any of that stuff. But in the context of this, if they grow up in a really hyper religious household And let's say mom walks in and it's a 13-year-old boy masturbating. He's trying to figure out his body and she freaks out, right? And she says, that's a sin and God is watching you and all of these things. What's happening on a neurological level is arousal. So, of course, he's discovering his body, he's getting an erection, it feels good, that's natural, that's all the biological stuff is going on. And now he feels an immense amount of shame. And so when you have experiences that happen strongly together, then the neurons that are firing together will wire together. So now you've just started to create this dynamic in the brain, literally, that when there's things involving sex, it needs to be shameful, right? Because that's how it wired in the brain. And so, absolutely, it that is a huge piece of it. And even people who come from non-religious households, but they say that girls who have sex are whores, or like when you add shame to natural biological processes, this is starting to be the result of it. Right. And so I think your observation is probably pretty valid in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of taboo around sex, and we have a lot of issues with sex addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very interesting. And the more you speak, the more I see in my head. I'm like, it's like kind of putting two and two together about my past. This is all very interesting. What are the most important lessons that you've taken from your work or from some of your clients?
Well, there's so many, like, I literally go into every single session with a client, and I learn something new. I think some of the main things I've learned from this process, number one is trusting my intuition even more, right? When I feel that there's something off, even if I don't have proof for it, I show up for myself and I'm like, it doesn't matter. This is how I'm feeling. And this is how I'm going to approach it. I'm not going to be irrational, right? But I will still keep that awareness, right? So that's the first one. Number two is it totally reinforced my personal boundaries with people. Like my husband now, we have arguably a very healthy, great relationship, but that took a lot of therapy for me to get there because I had my own fears of abandonment. I had my own fears of rejection. And I think all humans do. Early on in the process, I had to be really careful to be like, this is absolutely not acceptable for me. You can do what you want. I'm not going to deal with this. And so essentially, what that translates to is listening to red flags and actually changing your behavior around the red flags instead of just being like, oh, it'll be okay. He'll get better or she'll change or, whatever, trying to fix and change other people. And so I think those have been my two biggest takeaways.
What are your main red flags in general? Because I feel like it's so difficult to pinpoint. Like you mentioned like your intuition, which I think is huge, and that is obviously very personal. For you, what are your red flags? I was like, no, absolutely not. After this,
I think behaviors matching words is the first one, right? So if I'm dating somebody or whoever's listening, if you're dating somebody new and they say, I'm going to pick you up at 6, okay? They don't show up at 6. They don't show up at all. And then they text you 4 hours later and say, oh, this, that, and the other happened. No, no. Okay. Maybe once things happen. Okay. And I don't want to sound
there is
like
a
that.
good excuse.
Yeah. Like, and I don't want to sound like this super rigid, judgy person, but I'm also much more firm in my boundaries now, right? I don't put up with near as much shit as I used to. But does the behavior match the words? Or are you always having to make excuses for this person? If you're having to make excuses for them, it's a problem. It's a problem because grown ass people who are responsible and don't stay a victim will own up to their shit. You know what I mean? So that's the number one big red flag. And then respecting boundaries. And I know that sounds super cliche as a therapist, but if you met somebody at a bar and you guys are like, hey, our chemistry's great, we want to have a one night stand or whatever, I'm a kink allied therapist. Y'all do what you want to do, make yourselves happy, cool, whatever. But you need to pay attention to people's boundaries. And if your partner or a potential partner steps over your boundaries, that's a problem. That's a red flag. And if they're like, oh, well, I forgot you said that, or I thought you meant it was about this and not that.
Right.
No, no, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think it's really beautiful because you said also that a therapist is not just for the person that is actually doing the or having the addiction. It's also for the other person who is perceiving, like, kind of being on the other side of the addiction, which is also really, really intense. And I think it's really important for everybody out there to understand that it's really for both. You are both involved here in that relationship. But
Mhm.
I think it's interesting because when we talked, I don't remember if I told you, but when we talked the first time, I was like, actually, I'm really, really interested in this because I think my ex partner was a sex addict and I knew something was wrong. I got cheated on, first of all. And then he was watching out porn. I don't know how much, but a lot. And he was shamed for his masturbation early on by his parents because he grew up in a very strict and religious household, and so all
I
of
mean,
this,
cash
all of
box.
these things,
Yeah.
right? He wanted to do anal sex when I didn't want to, and he was like pushing for it, so boundaries there, and he was masturbating a lot, and so really, I think it was more of a discovery for me as well. But
Yeah.
I think, like, as you said, a lot of women know, like deep down, they do know that something is wrong. But I know I was meddling a lot and whatever. And maybe it takes to a very healthy relationship to realize that that was
Yeah.
not healthy for that aspect. It was very healthy for so many other things, but that was definitely something that was not.
It's so hard because in our code of ethics, as a therapist, in our code of ethics, you are not allowed to essentially be a therapist to close family and friends. I could lose my license for that. I could potentially be fined and go to jail for that kind of stuff. And the reason why is because when you're too emotionally attached, you cannot see clearly. That's a normal human experience, you know? I'll have betrayed partners that come to me, and one of the first things I tell them is, please don't beat yourself up because we have to remember that somebody who likely has a sex addiction, they've mastered this, right? That was not on your radar. You don't get into a relationship thinking you're going to be with a sex addict. That doesn't. And 75% of the time, they find out by accident. These people don't come forward and say, "Oh, I have a guilty conscience. I need to tell you what I've been doing wrong, and I'm so sorry." Maybe 1 out of 4, and that's being generous, that'll happen. 75% of the time, what ended up happening for me is I found a picture of a naked woman on his computer that was dated, like, 2 weeks prior, and I was like I was looking literally for a picture for school because I was in, like, undergrad, or I was in school, and so I wasn't even looking for it. It just fell into my lap, and most of my partners, that's how they find out. Something happens. It's like, for lack of better words, and I love my addicts, and I'm not trying to make it sound a derogatory thing, but these addicts get so wrapped up in their lies and their secrets, and you can't keep all those compartments pushed down, and eventually something escapes. Eventually something comes out, right? And a lot of times for the partner, it is life shattering. I mean, they did a study not so long ago. There's a guy who works for the Addo Clinic. His name is Dr. Kevin Skinner, and he does great work, and I'll link his stuff. But he did a research, this was 15 years ago, and he was a marriage and family therapist. And he had a colleague who came to him and said, I have a woman who is my client. She meets full criteria for PTSD, but hasn't been exposed in the traditional ways, and I don't know what this is. And this was probably in the 90s, right? Before this was really even identified. And long story short, that prompted his decade research, and what he found was partners of betrayal trauma, so infidelity, your husband, your wife cheats on you, 96% of them have identical symptoms to PTSD.
Wow.
So it is, when I say it's shattering, and I still work as a consultant for other therapists who don't specialize in this, especially with betrayal trauma, because they'll be like, I'm working with this woman and shit, I know she's mad, but it's been 6 months. Like, why can't she get over it? Why can't she get her shit together? And I'm like, we're going to have to reel this in and we're going to have to slow this down because it's like imagining you wake up one day and the person you were sharing your life with isn't really Jimmy with brown hair who's an engineer. It's an alien from another planet that eats kids. And this whole time, you're just like, how did I not know that I was living next to a monster? How did I not know? How did I not see it? How did I not pick up on it? How did I not know? And so it really makes you question your own intuition. I mean, it fucks so much up. Like, sorry for the language, but it's a shit show and it's really hard for people.
All the language here is absolutely, yeah. I'm sure, especially if it's necessary. I can really relate to this. It's really relatable because I remember when I got cheated on, I was like, why me, first of all? And like,
Yeah.
how did I not see it coming? I was so oblivion to it as well. I was like, I could have not like imagine like a person that I chose that I was so devoted to and I was so madly in love with just did that to me. That was just, I couldn't wrap my head
Yeah.
around it. But
And
it
it
was
makes you question, like, well, maybe I choose bad people. Maybe like, it makes you question
for
everything.
yourselves. Yeah. I was
Yeah.
like, maybe I haven't been loving enough. Right. I'm like, I really took it on me. So it's really, really interesting. And I think I'm going to have to talk about it with my therapist next time that I talk about this because I don't know if I ever like really fully work through it.
I'm sure.
But I want to end on a positive note because luckily people like you exist, which means that even if you are a sex addict or if you've been on the other side, there is something that you can do.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And there are people out there who, like, anybody who works in this field loves what they do. And one of the things that I hear a lot from my guys that I work with is they're just like, I've never been able to be this honest before. And it is like another level of freedom. And I just love the shit out of them, right? They do nasty, weird shit. And I know that. But deep down, they're just wounded little boys and girls who some wires got crossed in their brain and they're, like nobody has a guide for being an adult. You don't know what you're doing half the time. But yeah, there are people out there. And I promise you, if it's not a good fit the first time or the second time, maybe it's the third time. But there are therapists who are good. There are therapists who know what the hell we're doing. And we're not going to judge you for it because, quite frankly, ain't nobody got time for that. Right.
And we're all human. So,
And we're all human. Absolutely.
yeah. Bailey, thank you so much. That was such an enlightening conversation. And I think it's so important to talk about these things and to know that there is solutions and people for that as well. So
And
thank you so much.
I'll
Yeah.
send you some links that you can put in. There's a website that you can go to literally take a quiz if you think you're a sex addict.
Wow.
It'll spit the results out and be like, yeah, you should probably look into this, or like, nah, you're fine. And then they've got quizzes for betrayal trauma. So if you're like, oh, maybe this is something I'm struggling with, you can take this little quiz and it'll be like, yep, you're absolutely struggling with this and it's causing a lot of problems for you. And then I'll give websites and search engines and specialists and that kind of thing. So if it's you, you're loved, you're worthy, you're valuable, there's somebody there to help you. If it's a loved one, there's somebody for them too.
Amazing. So everything will be linked in the description down below. Bailey, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for coming. Is there any final words? I feel like we've talked for an hour almost.
No, I'm just really grateful for the platform. I'm such an advocate. I like to correct misinformation that's out there. And so any chance that I get to be on podcasts to educate people on what sex addiction is, that you can heal from it. It's not gonna, there's a lot of things that you can do in a positive way from it. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the platform.
Thank you for the work that you do. And to everyone, thank you for listening. Subscribe, follow, you do you, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Bailey.
You're welcome. Bye bye.
Bye bye.